If you want to know the secrets of existence and the true meaning of life, I can't help you. But if you want some book recommendations, why not try reading the ones I wrote? If you're a fan of giant monster mayhem and anime weirdness, why not try Operation Red Dragon: The Daikaiju Wars Part 1? If horror is more your style, you can't go wrong with The Occult Mafia. Those who enjoy their fantasy with a dark twist may be interested in Emerald of Maddox City. And if you're interested in shared universes, why not read all three? Hop on down to the description for links to all 3 books on Amazon. Enjoy whichever ones you read, and enjoy the video. Alright, Snazzy. We've made it this far reviewing music without taking a hit. Since fortune favors the bold, I say we move forward with the Alice Cooper retrospective. Tackling every concept album from the King of Shock Rock? The last time you tried covering his work, you wound up in a dream state. Are you sure you're ready this time? Oh, I'm ready, Snazzy. I'm more than ready. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am the Omni Cooper, and welcome to Genre Benders, Obscurities, and Flawed Gems, where we look at the best stuff you've never heard of. I've mentioned this a couple times in the past, but I really enjoy collecting concept albums. Unlike your standard studio albums, every song on a concept album works together to tell a complete story, and usually a little extra effort is put in to make the experience cohesive. That's not to say every concept album is perfect, but when they work, they really work. So far, some of the best concept albums I've ever heard are from a man known as the King of Shock Rock, Alice Cooper. Born Vincent Furnier, this son of a minister was originally the frontman and lyricist for the Alice Cooper Band in the early 70s. The Alice Cooper Band was known for more than just shocking lyrics and rough-around-the-edges music. They also made use of heavy theatrical elements throughout their live shows, making each performance a full audiovisual experience. In this theater de grand guignol, Vincent played the character of Alice Cooper, a villainous fiend in eye makeup who didn't care what you thought of him and never held back in tormenting everyone around him. In real life, of course, Vincent Furnier was and still is one of the nicest people you'd ever hope to meet, but his critics at the time were incapable of making that distinction. I mean, honestly, who ever heard of someone wearing makeup and costumes for the purpose of playing a character on stage? I suppose next you're going to tell me Max Schreck wasn't a real vampire? Midway through the 70s, though, Vincent decided to go in a different direction from his bandmates. They parted ways, and Vincent had his name legally changed to Alice Cooper so he could continue performing his older songs and keep the stage persona. His grand debut as a solo act has gone down in history as one of the greatest concept albums ever recorded, and it is here where our journey begins.
Welcome to my nightmare.
This is an album I already spoke a little bit about when I reviewed The Nightmare, a televised adaptation that featured Cooper and Vincent Price in a very low-budget yet still enjoyable TV special that became the progenitor of the music video. I've said my piece on the special, but what do I have to say about the album? Well, what can I say? It's considered a classic for a reason. The plot is about a man named Steven, who is sort of an alter ego for Cooper. What that basically means is when Alice Cooper the artist wants to tell a story that doesn't involve Alice Cooper the character, Steven is the go-to third option. Steven is asleep and having a nightmare. Or is he? It seems that somebody is reaching out to him, but is it urging him to wake up or trying to keep him trapped in the nightmare forever? Being set in a dreamscape means Nightmare doesn't have the most solid of story structures, but that's entirely by design. While the story may not unfold in the most conventional of ways, it does give us a very interesting look into Steven's psyche. A dream can often tell us a lot about the person having it, and as we explore Steven's nightmare, we see that he has some serious mental issues. The pieces are all there, but they don't necessarily go together the way you might expect. I don't want to spoil any of it here, but when you do figure it all out, you'll appreciate how brilliant the storytelling is. I will say up front that you might have to watch The Nightmare and the live concert film in order to fill in all of the blanks. I know that's what made it finally click for me.
Musically, the album is solid, not to mention full of variety. While the overarching genre is hard rock, Cooper decided to stretch out a little and include some unexpected tunes. Along the way, we get the melancholy ballad Only Women Bleed, and the cabaret-infused Some Folks to shake things up. A little comedy is even sprinkled in thanks to Department of Youth, though even this comedic break becomes disturbing when taken in context. As listening experiences go, this is one of the few albums in existence that I can listen to from beginning to end without feeling the need to skip something, and that's a big deal to me.
Despite the controversy which continued to follow Cooper, or perhaps because of it, Nightmare did very well, and so an immediate follow-up was commissioned that was very different from what some folks were expecting. Maybe so, but as the song says, some folks never know what to expect. The song doesn't say that, Snazzy. Well, it could have. Here's a fun fact. Among Alice Cooper's celebrity fans back in the day were Groucho Marx and Mae West.
This might come as a surprise to some of you, given how many of Cooper's critics at the time were of the older generations which these two hailed from. However, Groucho and Mae were vaudeville veterans, and they recognized that influence in Cooper's act. While everyone else was balking at the grotesque and ridiculous antics of this strange character, Marx and West saw good theater and approved wholeheartedly. Groucho, in fact, called Alice Cooper the last great vaudeville act in the world.
That influence is abundantly clear in his second solo rock opera, Alice Cooper Goes to Hell.
The plot is right there in the title. Alice Cooper usually dies at the end of his shows, but this time he actually finds himself descending into the fiery pit afterward. Not exactly thrilled at the prospect of eternal damnation, Alice starts trying to find a way out, though the devil isn't going to make that easy for him.
Musically, Alice Cooper Goes to Hell is a huge departure from the previous album, with a sound that I would describe as old-fashioned.
While it's still a rock album, most of the music is done in a style reminiscent of cabaret and the popular tunes you might expect from a vaudeville show. Heck, it even features a cover of I'm Always Chasing Rainbows, a staple of the vaudeville circuit in its heyday that I'm sure some of you might recognize from the Has Been Hotel pilot. The story also has a classic vaudevillian setup of just putting a character in a setting and seeing what happens. It's very different for this genre of music, but it works.
Speaking as someone who grew up on Abbott and Costello, the Three Stooges, the Marx Brothers, and the Looney Tunes, I can tell you that this album follows the vaudeville formula to a T. Not to mention, it's genuinely funny. Cooper injects a sense of humor into the album, just as befitting of its vaudevillian roots as the main premise.
One song, for example, is a disco number, which rock fans might balk at until they realize that dancing disco for eternity is one of the tortures found in hell.
That is so absurd, you can't help but laugh. Yet amidst all the laughter is something heartfelt and personal.
The ballad I Never Cry is about Cooper's alcoholism, and how he uses booze to deaden his emotions rather than confront them.
Unlike the fiction of Only Women Bleed, this one was true to life.
Cooper really was struggling with an alcohol addiction at the time, and this song was his public confession. It would also be the first step on a very long road to recovery.
After this album's release, Cooper decided he had to get his life in order, so he checked himself into rehab. The results of that visit would not last long, unfortunately, but it would result in another great album.
I'm stuck here on the inside, looking out. I'm just another.
While he was in rehab, Cooper heard the personal stories of a lot of people who were also there, some with problems more severe than his own. Once he checked out, he took all of those stories, gave them a strange twist appropriate for shock rock, and compiled them all into another concept album entitled From the Inside.
That's basically the plot, mind you. It's a collection of tales from the inside of a rehab clinic where people with all kinds of problems are highlighted. Musically, it follows in the last two albums' footsteps, switching styles depending on the subject for variety, but the story here is what really makes it fascinating.
From the Inside does something a little bit different for the genre. Shock rock, as the name implies, is meant to shock. It's meant to use shocking lyrics and stage antics as a way of appalling the audience.
From the Inside has some really disturbing lyrics describing what the various characters have done or are going through, but the songs serve a deeper purpose here than just shock. At no point do we learn if the facility where these personalities reside is really a rehab clinic or actually a mental ward, and that's by design, because in a way, society's attitude is the same towards both. Mental wards and psychiatric institutes were not always places people went to get better. For a long time, they were considered dumping grounds for the unwanted. Having a family member committed was like sweeping dust under the rug, simply a way to remove a problem from your sight without properly handling it. At the same time, going to a rehab clinic was long considered a mark of shame. After all, why would someone go to rehab for something unless that person was a mess? Look at that pathetic drunkard/druggie/sex fiend being shipped off. Some people just don't have any self-control, I tell you.
Rehab or clinic, going to one was and often still is viewed as shameful.
From the Inside forces the listener to confront this shame directly to see what it's like inside such a place, and remind us all that the people within, despite their issues, are people all the same. Indeed, they could be any one of us.
Even though he had checked out of rehab, Alice Cooper was not out of the woods yet. It wouldn't be long before he'd start drowning himself in liquor again, and it would affect his work going forward. Dada is one of 3 albums recorded during Alice Cooper's blackout period.
This was a period in which he was perpetually blind drunk, and thus he cannot remember anything from that time in his life. He knows that he worked on the albums, but he has no clue what working on them was like.
Since this video is just about the concept albums, we won't be looking at those other 2. But using Dada as our example, we can see how badly his work was affected.
Our issues begin with the story. Most people agree that Dada is a concept album, but nobody's entirely sure what it's about. The best guess I've heard is that it's about a man named Sonny whose mental state has fractured into multiple personalities. But that's only a guess. Some have figured that the reason the plot is so obfuscated is because, as the title suggests, it is a work of Dadaism.
For those of you who don't know what Dadaism is, let me put it this way. Suppose you go to an art museum and you see a sculpture that just looks like a bunch of garbage piled on top of a pedestal. You don't know what exactly it's supposed to mean because it just looks like a pile of garbage. But it's in an art museum, so it has to mean something, right? So you spend hours examining it from every possible angle, trying to figure out what it means, until eventually the museum says they're closing and they kick you out. So you spend months after that trying to discern the meaning. You rack your brain and you just can't piece it all together and it's driving you mad. So finally, you track down the original artist, go to his apartment, hold him at gunpoint, and insist that he tell you exactly what that sculpture means. And the artist tells you that it doesn't mean anything. He just put a bunch of garbage onto a pedestal and told the museum it was art. With this revelation, you proceed to stab the artist in the neck with a paintbrush and run to the nearest skyscraper so you can throw yourself off the top of it. That's Dadaism. And if you are a true Dadaist, you can't tell me I'm wrong.
Anyway, if you know that this specific album was recorded during Cooper's blackout years, you know that pinning the story issues on an anti-establishment artistic movement is no excuse.
Heck, if you know anything about real Dadaist music, you'd know that this album is too melodic to qualify.
Dadaist music is more accurately described as random noise with gibberish lyrics, the sort of stuff deliberately meant to defy established notions of what music could be, whereas this album has actual melodies and words.
There's no way it can be Dadaist music in that regard.
And that, my friend, just might make it the greatest Dadaist album ever recorded.
Now you're just being obtuse.
Maybe. But even if the music here is actual music, that doesn't mean it's good.
It starts off promisingly enough. The opening track, which is also the title track, is a spoken word piece in which Sonny speaks to his therapist while some really creepy ambient music plays.
It sets the tone for a story that'll be really dark and spooky, but the rest of the album fails to carry that atmosphere forward.
The quality is all over the place, with most of the songs sounding like they were made by someone who just wasn't trying. The only songs I regularly listen to from it are the opening track, Formerly Warmer, I Love America, and Pass the Gun Around. The rest is just unpleasant, and not in the way shock rock is meant to be.
After this, Alice Cooper hit rock bottom. His alcoholism had consumed him, and his health had declined to such a point that he was practically dead.
At his lowest point, he called out to God for salvation, and God answered. In interviews, Cooper states that he actually felt the addiction leave his body when he converted to Christianity.
Once he was healthy again, he returned to his music with a newfound vigor.
He did not abandon his villainous stage persona, but he did have a new lease on life, and even took it upon himself to help other musicians from succumbing to substance abuse the way he did.
He released various regular albums throughout the 80s, and by the 90s he was ready to revisit the realm of the rock opera. To tell this story, however, he would need help from a different kind of raconteur.
Lost in America, lost in America, lost in America.
Some combinations are so obvious that they were always meant to be. Peanut butter and jelly, Laurel and Hardy, America and apple pie, dinosaurs and robots. Other combinations don't seem obvious until they happen, and then you wonder why they didn't happen sooner. Such a combination is that of Alice Cooper and Neil Gaiman, who would work together on The Last Temptation, a rock opera as fantastical as it is deeply personal.
Stephen is a child with no real direction in life, which makes him the perfect target for a mysterious figure known as the Showman. Stephen is lured into the showman's trap with the promise of a fascinating carnival spectacular, but sideshow attractions are just the beginning. The showman presents Stephen with different visions of how his adulthood will turn out, each one a bleak future no one would ever want to live in. But the showman claims he can save Stephen if he signs a contract with him. Stephen can join his traveling circus and never have to really grow up. It will only cost the boy his immortal soul.
As you can no doubt surmise, The Last Temptation is partly inspired by the story of Faust, albeit with a twist.
The focus is once again on Stephen, only this time he's depicted as a kid of indeterminate age. The implication is that he's in adolescence, that awkward stage where he's just starting to grow up, but parts of him are still clinging to childhood. That dichotomy was present in Stephen's first appearance, but applied as a form of psychological trauma. Here it's literal, and thus makes Stephen the perfect target for the showman, who is clearly meant to be the devil.
Unlike Faust, though, Stephen struggles with the showman's temptations rather than give in to them and then eventually get bored.
He has two conflicting fears. On the one hand, he's afraid of what the future might hold for him, especially after his first encounter with the showman. But on the other hand, he also fears what might happen if the showman is tricking him. The metaphor here is largely based on Cooper's struggles with his alcoholism, which was precisely the horrible tool that drew him away from the light.
The culmination of this story is Stephen's ultimate rejection of evil and acceptance of God, and you can hear the passion in Cooper's voice as he sings this into being on the final track.
Go to hell.
Of course, Cooper had been back in form for years by this point, but even compared to albums like Trash and Hey Stupid, you can tell there's a different energy here.
In many ways, The Last Temptation is a combination of a parable and a personal testimony that makes for something really special in the annals of rock and roll.
Not to mention the album got a rather unique piece of multimedia in the form of a graphic novel adaptation.
The comic, split into 3 chapters, expands on certain aspects of the story not directly addressed on the album, like Stephen's school life or the various ways in which the showman gets under his skin. It makes for a great companion piece to the album, but also stands well on its own with some haunting visuals and loads of atmosphere.
I suppose I should also address a piece of speculation surrounding this album.
As noted, this album features a younger version of Stephen, who first appeared in Welcome to My Nightmare. This has led many fans to wonder if the two albums are connected, with The Last Temptation serving as a prequel to Nightmare.
Opinions are divided. Some people are convinced that these two albums are connected, while others aren't so sure Cooper ever intended for that connection to exist.
If the whole point of The Last Temptation was to show Stephen overcoming evil, why would he connect it to an album that would completely undo that conclusion? Would a devout Christian really make a story in which the devil wins out in the end?
Personally, I don't think these two albums tell the same story, but then again, how can Stephen still be in both of them if they're not connected? Well, the answer to that is simple. You remember the whole vaudeville connection?
Back in the olden days, vaudeville performers had go-to stage personas they would use for multiple stories, but that didn't necessarily mean there was continuity between them. Officially, Duck Soup is not a sequel to Horse Feathers, nor is Hit the Ice at all connected to Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. The same logic applies to these concept albums. Steven, and for that matter Alice Cooper himself, can appear in multiple stories without the need for continuity between them, because that's how vaudeville works. I just figured I would put that forward before we move on.
Now I suggest bracing yourselves for this next segment, because the albums which follow are a 1-2 punch of social commentary that doesn't hold back.
It's such a brutal planet. It's such an ugly world.
Technically speaking, these next two albums were released a year apart from each other, but they follow along similar lines, and these days they're usually packaged together. As such, I'll be reviewing Brutal Planet and Dragontown simultaneously.
Brutal Planet is presented as an examination of a literally godforsaken world. The portrait painted is a place where the worst of humanity is on display, impossible to avoid or ignore. Dragontown brings us deeper into this setting, and implies that perhaps the location isn't really on Earth, but in hell itself. In both albums, we are treated to songs describing the people who live there, and listen to the descriptions of their horrible existences.
The albums are unrelenting on any front. The lyrics are scathing condemnations of human ugliness, and the music rubs your face in that ugliness like few other albums can.
You get everything from general depictions of gluttony and abuse to specific accounts of school shootings and hollow faith, all of it conveyed through an industrial metal sound that feels like a punch to the gut. One song that feels particularly relevant for our times is Pessimistic, told from the perspective of someone so inundated with negativity that he doesn't know anything else. He now chooses to intentionally drown himself in 24-hour news and propaganda, but I repeat myself, and will react violently to anything that goes against his fatalistic outlook. How many people does that describe these days?
Between these albums, there are only 2 songs that provide any sort of comedic respite, and even then, they don't relent that much.
It's the Little Things is sung from the perspective of Alice Cooper the character, as he describes how he'll inflict disproportionate retribution on people who wrong him for the slightest of offenses. It's intentionally ridiculous, but still paints an image of someone dangerous to be around. On the other hand, we have Disgraced Land, a twisted retelling of Elvis Presley's death in a style evocative of the King's rockabilly tunes.
Again, it's exaggerated and ridiculous, but it also feels like it's in very poor taste. Because it is. Deliberately.
These 2 pseudo-breaks in the tone aren't really breaks at all. Instead, they present 2 rock and roll icons as people whose lives should not be emulated.
In summation, you might laugh, but you might also feel terrible for laughing. And that's the point.
These 2 albums are expertly made, but because of the subject matter, they're not easy to listen to on a regular basis. Ergo, once Alice had said his piece, he returned to the realm of pure escapism.
Well, they found my diary today.
So now that the real-world horror is out of the way, we can get to something that's just meant to be schlocky fun with Along Came a Spider.
The album is comprised of excerpts from the diary of Steven, alias the Spider. Steven suffers from crippling arachnophobia and has dealt with it by becoming a serial killer. He specifically targets women and cuts off a leg from each victim so he can construct his own gigantic human spider.
Not sure I follow the logic there.
He's a lunatic, Snazzy. It's not supposed to make sense.
Things get complicated for Steven, though, when he unexpectedly falls in love with one of his targets, and even starts to experience a bit of a spiritual awakening. But something is off about this diary. Something that doesn't add up, and might cause the whole thing to unravel like spider silk.
Unlike the last 2 albums, Along Came a Spider isn't asking the audience to do anything other than just sit back and enjoy the ride.
This is a twisted tale of love and death, presented with all the campiness of a 70s horror film, but with enough substance to keep you mentally engaged.
Like I said, something about the story isn't quite right. And being that the narrator is a psychopath, we have to question how much of it is meant to be taken as true, if indeed any of it is.
I don't want to oversell it as a mystery worthy of Sherlock Holmes or Alfred Hitchcock, but the twist at the end really does bring everything together in an intriguing way. It might take a few listens to fully get what's going on, but I guarantee you'll figure it out.
So yeah, I really enjoy this one, and I'm saying that as somebody who doesn't usually go for the slasher genre. We've only got one more stop, and it's someplace very familiar. And so our journey ends, for now at least, in a similar place to where it began. The last Alice Cooper concept album as of this posting is Welcome to My Nightmare, which I will be referring to henceforth as Nightmare 2 for the sake of brevity.
We once again meet up with Steven, and I believe it's safe to say that this time he's the same Steven from the first album. Still shaken from the events surrounding his initial nightmare, a fear exacerbated by paranoia that he will die in his sleep, Steven has been forcing himself to stay awake. The body has its limits, though, and Steven eventually succumbs to his fatigue. The next thing he knows, he's on a train bound for the pits of hell. But this is just another nightmare, right? The fluidity of the events he experiences would suggest as much, but then why does he seem so lucid through it all?
This doesn't just sound familiar, Omni. It sounds downright repetitive.
Not to worry, my reptilian friend. Nightmare 2 only seems like a rehash.
As you can no doubt tell, it combines the premise of the first Nightmare and Alice Cooper Goes to Hell, and there are plenty of similarities to be found to its predecessors, right down to the inclusion of another song about disco being used for eternal torture.
It's definitely familiar ground for the king of shock rock, but Nightmare 2 is no mere rehash. It turns out that taking those two concepts and combining them together actually opens up possibilities to make for a very different experience.
We once again get insights into Steven's messed up psyche and a window into what he did in life, but the question then becomes whether these are memories influencing a nightmare or an explanation for why he's burning in HE double hockey sticks.
Much like with Along Came a Spider, things are not what they appear to be at first glance.
The album did generate a bit of controversy, only this time it was from the fans in response to certain musical choices. Specifically, the opening track I Am Made of You makes heavy use of auto-tuning, and the later track What Baby Wants features pop star Kesha as a guest vocalist.
Now, despite his status as a hard rock singer, Alice Cooper had always experimented with the musical trends of each new decade. But these choices really threw people for a loop.
Kesha was from a completely different genre, and auto-tuning had garnered a bad reputation as a way for talentless hacks to become singers who sounded like robots.
Can these choices be justified? Can you indulge in these sort of things and still call it rock and roll?
Well, bringing Kesha on was inspired by Cooper meeting her at the Grammys and thinking she had the makings of a rock singer, and I think that in context the two work quite well off each other. What Baby Wants is a bit more poppy than the rest of the album, but it's still got teeth to it. I'm not a Kesha fan, and I still think this works well enough.
Okay, but what about the auto-tuning? Well, the way I see it, auto-tuning is a tool. And just like any tool, it works best when it's used correctly. The way it's used on Nightmare 2 is one of those ways.
The song I Am Made of You is a Christian song, and the auto-tuned parts are where Cooper describes his life before finding God.
The artificiality of the auto-tuning makes his voice sound hollow and distant, which is exactly the point.
I was alone.
When God enters the picture, the auto-tuning is dropped, and Cooper's natural voice is able to shine through like a warm light.
I am made of you.
As a result, the song has a unique atmosphere unlike anything else in the whole discography, and it's largely thanks to utilizing auto-tuning in a way that works. It was experimental to be sure, but the experiment bore fruit.
So overall, Nightmare 2 more than justifies its existence, and makes for an excellent follow-up to the original album.
Now, of course, this is not the last Alice Cooper album ever recorded, and there are many standard albums between all of these rock operas that we didn't cover because, well, they're not rock operas.
Personally, though, I think the rock operas are the best demonstration of what Alice Cooper has to offer as an artist.
Even with the low point that is Dada taken into account, these tales of madness, monsters, and mayhem are gold standards for the rock genre, running the full gamut from spooky to silly while making full use of their auditory format. Whether you view them as horror, vaudeville, or something in between, I guarantee that you'll remember them for one reason or another.
I don't know if there are other albums like these on the horizon, but if there are, I'm sure Alice Cooper will deliver, because that's just what he does. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Cooper signing off. Man, this leather jacket is noisy. And the eye makeup is really uncomfortable. I have no idea how he does this for a living.
If you enjoyed what you just saw, hop on down to the description for links to Patreon, DeviantArt, and all of our social media, as well as links for Operation Red Dragon, The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, The Occult Mafia, and Emerald of Maddox City, 3 original novels I think you'll really enjoy. Thank you all, and we appreciate your support.